Next up, we have Dr. Claire McKay Bowen with Generating Synthetic Data for Data Privacy in R. Claire McKay Bowen is a lead data scientist for privacy and data security at the Urban Institute. Her research focuses on assessing the quality of differentially private data synthesis methods and science communication. In 2021, the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies identified her as an emerging leader in statistics for her technical contributions and leadership to statistics and the field of data privacy and confidentiality. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Really excited to see your talk. Take it away. Thank you so much, Dr. Bowen.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to take one moment and tell people that if I'm speaking really fast because of my elevated heart rate, it's because I just submitted an NSF report. So I don't know if anybody has ever gone through all that. It's like really stressful, but like really, really exciting because it's all done. And you're like, yes, we did great work. But then up to that point, it's like, oh my goodness. So apologies again ahead of time on that part. But it was related on data privacy. And this is why I'm just really excited to be here to talk about this kind of work. This is an introductory level. So this is to give you an idea of what do I mean by generating synthetic data for data privacy and how you can do that in R. So again, just a quick overview of first setting the ground on what do I mean by data privacy? Because a lot of people have different ideas. So just making sure we're all on the same page. Why is it something that you should care? Because that's something that I encounter often is a lot of people think, well, this doesn't apply to me. Why should I even think about this when dealing with data? And then go into a little bit background and methodology on how is this done to address these issues before actually diving into the R code. And again, that's because most of the time when I talk to people about this topic, they've never even heard of it or even have any idea about it. So we just have to do some like a short, but hopefully entertaining lecture before going into the R code. So the motivation behind this, well, I like to talk about the executive order that happened on the first day of Joe Biden's his presidency, because it was really impactful to hear that he said we should have more access to data, and especially disaggregated data, meaning we need more information about people, including people of color and others who have been historically underrepresented. And in order to do that, we have to allow people to access that valuable data set. But there are privacy concerns because one, you get more information that naturally opposes having privacy. So you can't have all the privacy and all the usefulness of the data because they naturally oppose one another. And why is this a concern? That despite President Biden being like, hey, we need to do this, it's harder or it's easier said than done. It's actually very hard. And this is a screenshot from a New York Times article that I read back in, I believe it was December 2019, that I found was very impactful in explaining why it's really hard to protect people's information. In this data set, there was no personally identifiable information, meaning their names, gender, and some other demographic information was not available. It was just showing the person's location over time via their smartphone tracking. And the New York Times article authors tracked one particular person and realized that they had to obviously work at Microsoft because they were on the campus during working hours. But then they noticed an interesting change in that pattern when they went to the Amazon campus one afternoon before continuing on again back to Microsoft until a couple months later, they started going regularly to the Amazon campus. Now, with just that kind of information, they were able to find him on LinkedIn and figured out that his name was Ben Bernoli and he took a job at Amazon. So again, there was no identifiable information about even his gender on that data set, but they were able to identify him pretty quickly. And so what does it just stop, let's say, employers using this information to say, I don't know, prematurely fire you knowing that you're looking for another job? And so some people then think, okay, well, obviously that is too much information, location and time, we shouldn't do that. But that kind of information is what is very helpful for what is the current crisis that we've been experiencing now in the last year. These are screenshot articles from 2020 where people were calling to say like, well, we don't have enough public data to fight COVID-19. We need this information. We need this location information in particular from smartphones to figure out, I don't know, contact tracing. So all those calls for contact tracing requires access to your phone to figure out where you are in location and time. And so this also comes back to, here's another screenshot I got from earlier this year, where again, the lack of data, especially racial data, was hampering our rollout for the vaccine too. So obviously there's this big need, but with that simple example I gave you before, it's easy to identify people and to exploit that information in very aggressive ways. So this is why at Urban Institute, we're working on ways to expand access to data safely in a way that you can still use that information for those really impactful research projects, like, trying to figure out the best ways to apply the vaccine in certain areas, especially those for groups that are more affected. And especially with the upcoming evictions, people are concerned about that too. So those are all things that we're looking at urban, but then at the same time, remember, not being able to identify those individuals. So what is actually being done? It's not like we've never had these problems before. It's just becoming more and more prominent, especially with the call to have better expansion to data. So traditionally, when we access confidential data, you can kind of think of it into like 3 different kind of layers here. So I call it the user interface layer, those who want access to the data, the privacy layer, what do we have to do to alter it? And then of course, the data access layer, where does the confidential data lie? So basically the data users, usually the researchers, data practitioners, and so on and so forth, say like, hey, there's certain kind of queries we want. And so the privacy expert gathers these along with what we call the data maintainer or the curator, the one who's responsible for basically taking care of the confidential data. And they work together to figure out, okay, what are these queries? What are the kind of analysis that people want to do onto the original or confidential data? And what kind of statistics we want to preserve from it in order to make sure that those parts are preserved while being altered. So in statistics, we call the methods that alter the data statistical disclosure control or limitations. So if you see SDC or SDL, that's what it stands for. And so after having these statistics altered or parts of the data being altered, you get some sort of results out where it's either you have an interface where there's some medium between you and the data set that you submit your analyses or queries to it, and you get a noisy answer back, or you get a public use file, which is most often what people get access to is some sort of public version of the data set that has been highly altered for privacy purposes. And so why is this so hard to implement this framework, and why don't we get more access to data? Well, in the case of getting the public data, when somebody has like, I need access to low income, some questions come into the fact of how do you measure the usefulness of the data, which is pretty tricky because you can imagine that there can be an infinite number of different things that people could do to the data, and you can't account for all of them. And it's also really hard to measure also the disclosure risk or the privacy of the data without having said, hey, how is somebody going to attack the data? So you have to do this kind of like prediction of trying to figure out like, what are people going to do? How are they going to attack it? And then that's how you measure it. And then that kind of help you dictate how you're going to alter the data, which again, easier said than done. So it's a little tricky. The other way, when I was talking about there's some interface between you and the data set, this kind of query-based method, it's a little bit, that seems really nice, right? Because there's something in between you and the data. And so you're like, well, that's very private and I still get the answers out. But the issues with this kind of framework is that how much noise should you add is, let's say in this case, when it says, when the person's asking what is the average income, is 5,000 enough? Or is that too much? Maybe we need to back that off because it's unnecessary amount of noise being added to the data. Or is that not enough? Maybe that's too identifying and then we have to add more to that. And so that's kind of hard also to balance. And then also, how do you limit the number of queries? Because, well, frankly, people are smart and clever, and so they'll try to game the system, and it's hard to predict how people are going to game the system. So let's say, for instance, in the follow-up question, somebody was trying to be clever and said, well, how much does Claire's income deviate from the average? And so then in 2 questions, my privacy would be violated. So again, that's kind of hard to protect, is trying to figure out like who is trying to be clever and how are they going to try to attack the data. And so as a brief methodology of like how people do protect the data, I'm just going to cover mostly on how things get altered, and then finally leading up to synthetic data, because a lot of these methods are what inspired synthetic data generation. Though, at least as a side note, because we just talked about biostatistics, it was really biostatistics where synthetic data came from, because it was motivated by clinical trials and missing data. So as a side note, I think kudos to biostats on that one. So how are the ways that people do protect data in order to do the public release side? So that's the public published file that I was talking about earlier. And so I like to use this painting example to help explain the ways that we alter data. This is very iconic painting. Everybody kind of knows about the figures in the park here. And so just imagine this is our confidential data, and like, how are we going to alter this? And so one of the easiest ways is suppression. So here you can see that we just removed a few people from here. And that typically happens when you have like very unique individuals in the data and you don't want them to be part of it. So like, let's say if somebody is over 85 years old, you tend to not want to have that person in the data set because it's, again, very easy to figure out who they are. And then another one is generalization, where you kind of categorize people into different groups. So you see that often with age. Instead of reporting the specific age, you say like somebody's between the ages of like 30 to 34, 35 to 39, 48 to 44, so on and so forth. And so in this example here, I picked one color of green, one color of blue, and so on and so forth. So this is why it's just kind of like it. You still see the pain, but it's a little bit weird. So another one is sampling. So this was first inspired by census to save money, right? Because it's really hard to, well, we just did the 2020 census. That is expensive to go try to get a full entire count across the nation. And so sometime in, I believe it was like early 1900s, I thought it was 1940, but I'm not entirely sure if that was the timeline, that they came up with the idea of sampling to save money, but then it's actually become a statistical disclosure control technique where you just subsample down the data as a way to like give some like plausible deniability that somebody's actually part of this data set. So in this example here, I did a sampling rate about, I think it was 70%. So, but traditionally you get something much smaller, but I wanted to do it 70% because then you can kind of see that some of the pixels are missing in this picture here. Another one is noise infusion. So you're just adding random noise, either more methodically or either by like, let's say, for instance, from a specific distribution like a normal distribution or a uniform distribution. This is actually from a normal distribution. It was interesting because it was randomly picking pixels how to lighten and darken it. So you can still kind of see the picture, but it looks like the old tube TVs with the snow, for those who still remember the tube TVs. So that's what it kind of looks here. And then now finally get to synthetic data, which is like to the point of this talk, is that in synthetic data, you try to think of like, what is the statistical representation of the data that you want to preserve and target on that, and then kind of smooth everything else out. Because again, you can't have perfect privacy and perfect usefulness of the data. So there's some things that have to be sacrificed. So let's just say in this picture here, I want to preserve the qualities of the people in the park and everything else can get smoothed out. So you can see prominently the figures, but you can't see very well the boat or the trees or even the dog or umbrellas because they're not people. So these are the parts that we're going to highlight because that's the model we ended up picking. So now we're getting to the heart of exactly how do we generate synthetic data. And so you can roughly categorize them into two kind of categories. One is a non-parametric approach. And so again, this is an introduction, so we're just going to take it very simple. Whereas let's just say our data is the number of individuals on the y-axis and on the x-axis is the bins for income. And so we can think of these marginal tables as a very basic way to generate the synthetic data is by doing random sampling from each of these bins. And so we can just do that and we can get something that's very close, but not quite the same. So this is a very simple way to do, again, generate the synthetic data from a non-parametric perspective here. So what about parametric here? So this is more like what you can call like a model-based approach. And so in this case here, let's say that the y-axis is again the number of individuals, but the x-axis is height, and we bend them across. And traditionally, we kind of think of height as being normally distributed. So in this case, we're going to take view it as a probability distribution. So we're going to identify appropriate probability distribution and then make draws based on that. So we figure out what the sample mean is and then the sample standard deviation, and then we'll make draws from that. And so you get something kind of close, but it's still not quite the same. So this is another way to do generate synthetic data from here. Oh, and so with that, I'm going to exit this because now we're going to go actually into the R portion, which is how do we do all that Claire just said. So I got to exit out there. And then going to get into my R screen here. As a side note for those who are interested, I did make some notes too, so I'll loop that back into, but just letting you know, I also made notes with the R code. So the example I like to give is like we use a Star Wars data set because I'm a huge Star Wars fan. So the only package that we're going to be using is the tidyverse because I like the pipes. I don't know if people like the structure of that, but I do. And so we're going to take the Star Wars data set. I made some alterations to make it easier data set because again, this is an introduction and I don't want people to deal with like some really weird variables or the fact that I think, oh yeah, I noted remove Jabba because his mass is so high and it skews the data. So we remove Jabba from the data set. So let's going to quickly make sure that everything got loaded. Yep. So the data set that I subset down from the Star Wars one was I looked at mass and then I looked at the species. So I simplified it to humans, droids, and I think that was humans or non-human because I was trying to be sensitive to like the aliens because only us humans calls them aliens, right? So anyways, all right, so that looks like that's good. And so now we're going to take the first example, which is doing a marginal table. So that requires us to know the number of observations and then calculate the number of observations with each of the groups. So the marginal table ones works really with the species variable. So we're going to do that. I'm going to store that value and then figure out the number of species here. So we see that there are 4 droids, 22 humans, and 31 non-humans. And let's see, what does N say? There's a total of 57 observations. All right, so we're going to go look at the proportions of these because we're going to do using the sample function. So we see that this is roughly the proportions of each of the species within for the total. And I'm going to set the seed so that this is replicable here. And yes, I purposely use 42 for those who are Douglas Adams fans. So I'm going to synthesize again. I'm going to use sample, right? Because I found the number of species, the total is n. I'm going to say replace equals true. And then I'm weighting the probability based on what we observed in the data. And so now I'm going to use table to just kind of view this. So now we have 9 droids instead of 4, and then 23 humans and 25 non-humans. So this is close, but not quite. And that's the idea of synthetic data. You want to get kind of close to the values, but if you get the same exact values, then you're basically replicating the whole data again. All right, and so we see here that are proportions, which those look pretty close to what we saw earlier. And then for just a quick, so that way people can see that how close they are. So it's not bad. We just got twice the number of droids though. So yeah, that's all right. I like droids. More robots are cool, right? All right. All right, so that's just a simple way to do the marginal distributions. And some people might think, okay, well, that's really simple. What's the next step? For more intermediate stuff, you can do more advanced empirical distributions from there. Now for probability distribution, because again, we're taking a parametric approach, I'm going to quickly view the data for the mass because again, we got to make sure that we pick the right one. And I like to visually see how the data looks. So this is how the distribution of the different observations we had that with the mass. So it's not quite a normal distribution, but you guys will just bear with me and just say it's kind of normally distributed. That's why I took out Jabba, because Jabba was like off the scale and this distribution looked really funny. But just bearing in mind and you guys all humoring me and the fact that this is all fictional anyway, because it's Star Wars and somebody went and got the mass of all the characters on there. So really, again, you guys are just being nice and humoring me on this. So we're going to say it's normally distributed. So we're going to get the sample mean and oops. Okay. And the sample mean. So we see it's about 76 kilograms here. And then the next thing we need for a normal distribution is the sample's standard deviation. So here it's about 29.28 kilograms. Okay. So then you can generate your synthetic data with using R norm in this case, because R is awesome and has all these standard probabilities distributions in here. So I set my seed again, and I'm going to use R norm to generate my synthetic data. And so again, we need to double check how that looks. So I will visualize that soon. But first I'm going to check the sample mean, which is 79.94. So that's pretty close. 76, 79. Oh, that's not too bad. And then the standard deviation is 30.61, which is pretty close to the 29. So that's not too bad again. All right, now we're going to go plot this and see how it compares with our last one. So it's not great, right? Because it was, if we look at the original data, we still had a little bit more over here, and the width was, or the range, excuse me, was a bit wide, but it's kind of, it's not bad, but it's not great. But you get the idea about how we can generate the synthetic data. And in all honesty here, we don't want to make it super accurate, because what if the observations are really sensitive about their weight and they really don't want you to know specifically their weight? So we're all doing them a favor. We're prioritizing privacy over utility here. So anyways, all right, another example that I will be using is a regression model, because I did say it's like you could take a model approach, and this expands to not just using regression. You could use CART or regression trees to generate synthetic data. But again, trying to make this an introductory talk here, I'm going to focus on using a regression model here. So in this case, it's really important to know what is the model you're going to do. So in this case, I was thinking, well, mass should probably depend on species here. And so I'm going to gather what are the coefficients in this model here. So we get an intercept of 69.75. Here's the coefficient for the species, for when the species is human and species are not human, because remember, this is was categorical data here. And so then we can look at, again, because we had, so droid here is going to be the dummy variable, or setting it to 0, and then we have human and non-human here. So just a quick reminder. Now, when we do this model, we need to, or generate the synthetic data, because the model depends on the species, we're going to randomly generate the data for the droid, the human, and the non-human based on the coefficients here. So this set of code here is just showing you how we can take that coefficient and then saying, okay, I want it to be, remember, for droid, it's the first variable is the intercept, and because it's the dummy one, it's 0 for the rest of them. And so then we're going to add some random noise per linear model assumption, because we're doing our ordinary least squares, right? So there's an assumption that there's a little bit of noise. So in this case, I'm going to add noise with centered at 0 with a variability of the 29.3 from our earlier standard deviation from the, well, let me click this over again, from this data, right? Because we're generating the new synthetic data. So I'm going to set the seed again to replicability and do this for not just droid, but also human and non-human. Okay. Clear all that. And then now that we have the new synthetic mass. So this is our new generated data for the masses for our droid, human, and non-human, and then based on that regression model. And so then we're thinking, okay, well, how close were we on the mean and standard deviation compared to what we did earlier, which was we just assumed like a normal distribution. So we see a mean of 76.56. So let's actually, I'm going to scroll back up. What did I call it again? Mean mass. I think it was mean mass. Yeah, that's actually not too bad. I kind of forgot what the outputs were. That's why I'm surprised. So then for this, I think it's SD mass then, based on my naming conventions. Okay, so the standard deviation is a bit wider, but it's actually not too bad. So based on our regression model, we actually replicated pretty well. So now remember, this is our original data, and so we're going to visualize this again to see how well we generate this. Okay, so it's a little bit more normally distributed. Not, I mean, yeah. It's okay. Again, we're trying to be respectful for all the species out there that are very sensitive about their weight. So again, that's a trade-off, is you're getting kind of close, but it's not perfect, right? So that is the basis for trying to generate synthetic data. And again, this is very simple. So again, people are wondering, well, what if I want to do, I think I saw a comment earlier. Let me go scroll back up. Like, could you do multiple normal distributions? Yeah, you can. So the question is, let me actually repeat it carefully, because I know this is recorded. So could you use multiple normal distributions? I think I would use 3 to 1 for the left, or 1 for the right, and then one really tight one for the big middle and the bar. Yeah, so you could disjoint the data and then apply different models to those, or different normal distributions. You can do basically any model that, as long as you can identify what are the sufficient statistics or the things that you need to therefore then generate the data. The thing is, you have to be very careful when you select the model, because there's some biases with that. So that's actually one of the things that I wanted to end with this talk, is discussion of, you need to be very careful when you select the model, because you can introduce unintended biases, or if you might have identify the improper model. So there are some ways to tackle that. One is you're trying to be thorough and with anything, trying to figure out what is the proper model. There is a area of synthetic data generation called multiple synthetic data sets. So you can generate not just one, but multiple of them and then take the average of them. Or one way people do is like, well, I have like 2 models I think could fit the data, but I'm not entirely sure which one's better over the other because they preserve different features. So you might produce one synthetic data with the first model and another synthetic data with the second model. And then when you're doing inferences, you have to combine the 2. Now, some people think, okay, that's a great idea, but what is the drawback? The other one drawback is more data sets you generate, you're more revealing more information, right? So then you're having less privacy is being preserved. Another thing is that getting the inferences from multiple synthetic data sets is actually non-trivial once you go beyond variability. So if you want to do anything else beyond just getting the variance, it is a pain. So those are some of the issues there. All right, so then some people are just like a quick shout out. So this is, again, the 2021 talks. And so people think, okay, I really want the R code. So you can get the R code in this under my breakout, I think, yeah, breakout 4 track 2. I also have notes here. So let's see if I can, so I wrote them actually all out. So not just following the R code, you can just kind of read this and it kind of goes through the same thing I did on the slides. And then talks about how you can generate the synthetic data with the marginals, probability distribution regression, and just basically what I said, but just written all the way down here and maybe some additional information too. So, as well as my slides. So I just wanted to point that out in case people wanted to actually have something printed on the side. So this is what I was afraid of because I mentioned that my heart rate was like really up because I submitted something for NSF and I probably talked through this really fast because I have, I think, 15 more minutes. So given that, I'm just going to try to end this with, here's the summary of what we talked about, which is why privacy is so important, giving you some background and how we can think about generating, say, synthetic data, and then some of the R coding. So like before we totally wrap up and say, hey, we're going to use the rest of the time to ask questions because I talked way too fast because I was just so hyped up from all the work I was doing earlier, is we are hiring. You want to work on cool data. You want to work in data privacy in particular because you're like, wow, Claire, that was super exciting. I want to work on this all the time. Let's do this. But I'm kind of concerned because, as you just said, you did introductory talk on data privacy and confidentiality because there's just not a lot of, most students don't take those courses. I don't know what's going on. And so some people think like, oh, I need these very particular set of skills required over a long career. No, that's not what we want. So what we want is that you have experience programming in an open source language, so Python or R. I'm partial to R, obviously, so let's just stick with that one. And being able to apply your code or research principles to code, willingness to learn, have good organization skills, and also being able to communicate complex topics to diverse audiences. So that's what we're looking for. We are hiring. Submit your applications now because I would like to hire someone by the end of the year. That is my ultimate goal before Turkey Day. That is my goal. So anyways, any questions? And I guess I'd say thank you so much for having me and being patient as I totally streamlined through my 45-minute talk in 30 minutes.
Nailed it. So we do have some questions. So from one person we have, per your research area for supporting a data commons, does homomorphic databases figure into your strategy in support of a data commons? Or is your research focused on how to ensure the synthetic data cannot be tracked back to individuals?
That's a really good question. And it's actually more of the latter. I focus more on how do we publicly release the data. Now, homomorphic encryption is something that we have to still be aware of because it's part of the huge umbrella of how do we expand access to data. So we actually, at Urban, we're working on a project where we're doing a mixture of trying to expand access through a synthetic data set. Another one is we do that query base I talked about, but it's somewhere in between the confidential or the tiered access of getting full access to the confidential data and just the public use file. Where, what do I mean by that? Okay, so after you apply your analysis to the synthetic data, sometimes you wonder like, well, how close was I actually on this analysis? Like what is like to confidential? And so what happens is you take that analysis that you already debugged basically on the synthetic data and you put it through a server, what we call the validation server. And so that goes through that server and the server will return back an answer saying that it's this close or saying that this is actually the estimate, but it's actually kind of noisy. We're hoping to automate this. It's still early work. And so now you're wondering, like, okay, that's not homomorphic why you're talking about this. Well, these are all the different kind of pieces, again, under that umbrella of trying to expand access to data. So we actually are working, or I guess not working with, but we are in conversations with people who are using homomorphic encryption and how we can all work together in the federal data systems. And so I was just saying, like, that's our piece and there are others. So if you're really interested in that, I can get you connected with those people if you're curious, or at least knowing what their papers are. So
perfect. Let's take this question from Sam now. Oops. Did you get it? Can you? Okay.
Yes. Hello. Hi. Hey, Claire. Thanks for this talk. I do have a question about how would we do this when we have, say, more than 2 variables? Like if I want to generate synthetic data for 10 variables, how would I approach that?
yeah, that's a good question, especially because this again was introductory talk. So I just focused on 2 variables. And so I overly simplified it. So when you have multiple variables, you can think about, again, like what kind of model you want to base this on. So you could do that regression one, which is where I said like, oh, our dependent variables were categorical. So we can alter the data or do like that marginal kind of empirical approach first and then plug them into the coefficients to generate the output later. You can do a sequential method. So actually a really popular method right now to generate synthetic data, which apparently Census is also like going to be doing, because this is what we did with the, so one project was we are synthesizing IRS taxpayer data. And so what we did was a sequential classification regression trees or CART models. And so we just kind of broke up the data based on the tree branches and then synthesized it based on that. And then like one of the final steps we do is we try to identify if there's like too many unique values at the end and kind of smooth them out a bit, because again, there's those privacy concerns. So that's another way to do it. You can also do a Bayesian approach. So do a Bayesian framework where you identify what is your prior distributions in order to do your posterior distributions and generate synthetic data that way. So actually a lot of my dissertation was doing a lot of the synthetic data generation with a new privacy definition called differential privacy, where we did it within a Bayesian framework. And so we had to identify what are the sufficient statistics within those models and then alter those values in order to generate the synthetic data. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you so much.
Yes, excellent.
Okay, then I think Chase has a question.
Thank you. I was just typing this out. Dr. Bowen, that was great. Thank you. And I'm particularly interested in where your system's going to go. My question concerns private industry. How much do you know about like United Health and data silos like that, where they have super high quality information about individuals, medical interventions, and results therein? They do make them available within their company and spinoffs and so forth, but that goes through all sorts of anonymization practices. And of course, for outside researchers, which is where my interest is, that's a real challenge. So in your work, do you see any possibility of creating a genericized API? I know that's, yeah. How can more people get access to those data silos, basically, and yet still, yeah.
So that's a really great question. So I'm actually going to take it because again, I sped through my talk, so I can actually take more time to explain some of the more background. So we're going to take a big step back and talk about how people actually normally access data a little bit more in depth, and then get to finally to your question. So like I said, most people get the 2 tiers are, you get the highly altered data, like you said, which is, I mean, better than nothing, but strips a lot of information, or you get full access to the data, which one, it's hard because usually you have to do background checks, or in my case, I've accessed census data and IRS data, and both require clearances for that, which also has the stipulation of an eligibility requirement of you have to be a US citizen, which is really hard for researchers because we have a lot of great immigrant researchers in the United States, and why aren't we leveraging that brain power, right? We can't if they don't have access to the data. And so what Census and a few other federal agencies do is they have these federal data centers. So that was one of their quote unquote solutions. So they have these data centers where, okay, you can access the confidential data through these centers instead of trying to, like, because I should back up. Even if you have clearance, you have to have a means to get to the data. You can't do it through a browser. So you have to go to either to Washington, D.C. or to one of these data centers. So that was their partial solution of you don't always have to fly to Washington, D.C. Now, one of the issues with the data centers is despite them being, I think now there's going to be 31 because there's one being built right now across the United States, they're all concentrated to like highly prestigious institutions or cities. So like for me, I'm actually in New Mexico. And so the closest data center is in Denver. That's a 7-hour drive. So how equitable is that? That's really, really terrible. So that's why getting back to the validation server project I'm on, that was our in-between, was that there's no eligibility requirements. You don't have to, you have to go through a light and clearance process, and it's web browser based. Now, getting finally to Chase's question, well, what about like all this healthcare data or all these other ones? Like, is there a way we get an API or like what I said, the validation server to get people access? And so reason we're on this validation server project, actually, that was the one I was submitting to NSF on the report on. Yay, yeah. So is because there is, if you look at the 2018 Evidence Act, there was a call to do a national secure data center. That why don't we combine all the data across all these federal agencies that would be super valuable and allow researchers, public policy makers, data practitioners to access that data. It's still not being done. Even though there was a call in 2018 to do this, it still hasn't been done because it's hard. And so what we hope with this validation server project, and that's why NSF funded it, was to start making a roadmap with IRS to hopefully get that ball moving so that way others can help contribute and we can build up to going to the National Data Service. And so hopefully when that happens, then those private industry people will be like, oh yeah, this is something else that we can do. Let's adopt this. At least on the industry side, we did partner with Microsoft on this project. And so they are assisting with that. We just published today, because again, the report came out, the white paper on the infrastructure side. And then in the next couple of weeks, we'll be publishing the technical reports on the more nitty-gritty privacy methodologies that we explored for this server. So quick shout out for that project that again made my heart race and why I was so fast on my talk. I see thumbs up. So I answered your question then, Chase, right? Well, his hand was raised. Oh, 1 second. Oh,
sorry. Does this help anything?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Right. Great answer. The next follow-on though is, this quantified self, and you have industries like Apple. They are experimenting with homomorphic systems, and there seems to be some indication they actually might have a research commons, like through that research kit, because that ad-based system that they have actually is a homomorphic system that's supposed to anonymize and so forth. I don't know what the quality of that is. But where I'm heading is that I do sense we're going to have an inversion though, between what United Health has for people who have their insurance and all the information they get versus what's going to be on individual instrumented data. And that balance will shift in favor of the individual. So when I think about researchers like Dr. Topol, I think is his name, he's a big proponent that says the patient will see the doctor now. In other words, we're going to see a change in the medical health industry. But underlying all this though is privacy, being able to, if I extend my information to a medical team, I want it to be maintain privacy. But on the other hand, I need population-based studies to do research and compare myself relative to others. So do you see any glimmers with the influence of individualized data kind of forcing itself upon a healthcare industry where there's so many measurements? And if you approach a medical practitioner now, let me give you a concrete example. The researchers I work with, they want people to collect blood pressure every 30 minutes for their entire life. And they have examples of this. But if you go to your healthcare provider, they say, what? Only once a year. And yet with collection of blood pressure every 30 minutes, there's incredible diagnostic information you can have about what somebody's health trajectory is. So this quantified self is going to change the equation, but I don't see systems really supporting that, except for so far only Apple looks to have this. So do you have any comments about that, or have you even explored that area, what Apple's doing?
So that's a really good question. It's one of those, again, that I'm peripherally aware of, but it's not my research focus because the field is so big. And so one of the first things that comes to mind, and actually I talk, because somebody just mentioned I have a book. So I do have a book coming out in a couple months where the big call to arms for the field is communication, because most people aren't aware that this is coming out, that like, oh, if it's down to the private, like the individuals, how do you empower them to know what is available, what trade-offs they should make? And so I think before we even get to that point, we need to figure out like, how are we going to tell people that what are the trade-offs? What are you going to gain? What are you not? Because like the punchline I usually tell people is like, at what point do we sacrifice our personal privacy for the public good? Right? Because it's not just the person right there. Like you think about like, well, I won't see the doctor now, I'm going to get these results. The power behind the data is not just one person, but many. And so if there's too many people who opt out, then that weakens whatever models or algorithms or anything that tries to identify like, oh, based on past history, you're more likely to have this condition and we're going to help you. So that gets like all sorts of tricky about like how do we balance that to that it's going to help so many people, but not get a bunch of other people thinking like, wow, you're being very invasive of my privacy. I do not want this to happen. So like, again, so the first thing is communication. And then the second thing is laws need to change is another thing, which some of you are thinking like, well, don't we have a privacy law? Because there's like all these acts, and it's something that's interesting to that's kind of unique to the United States, because Europe already has something completely different. They have like one law, or I say one law, but they have a more generalized law for privacy stuff, especially because now the European Union has I always get the acronym wrong. It's GDPR, it's generalized protection. I always forget the acronym. Anyways, we don't have a GDPR here. And so people are like, well, what about these privacy acts? Like they are on different data sets. So Title 13 protects census data. Title 26 protects your taxpayer data. CIPC protects your labor employment data. HIPAA protects your medical. And then it's like FERPA protects this. Yeah, see, like I'm listing all these different laws because there's not one uniform one. And then by the way, we have no federal law protecting your consumer data, none whatsoever. So that's the other thing I'm saying. It's like we need to change our laws because it's getting a little ridiculous at this point, but I could go on for that. And I already see a hand raise. So yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on that too. That's I have no knowledge of the laws myself, but disclaimer, I should have put this on my slides. I'm not speaking as an employee of Evidation at all. I'm just speaking as a big fan, really. Like what I've been here for about 1.5 years, and it was really heartening to hear that privacy concerns and the trust of our participants was baked into the business from the start. Like that's really I'm finding it's much more challenging if it's not part of your incentive structure at the beginning to then try to duct tape things after the fact, which I think many bigger orgs are doing, but it's baked into the start here. And it's great because there's no question when it comes to making business decisions, like we can't sacrifice that. That's like a core principle. It's in the Constitution essentially. But then how do we get more, organizations to have that? Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, just echoing the whole, you need to have these conversations sooner. So that goes back to the communication. And then I think my other call to arms in the book was that we need to start teaching this in undergrad. Like it not necessarily a separate course, because some people say like, do we need a privacy course? I'm like, no. I think it should be in any course you are teaching about data, because I hear some students say that they think they get the raw data, for instance, the public use file. Some people think that's the raw data. I was like, no, that's been highly altered. So you need to be aware of like why there are privacy concerns, why the data has been altered, and that because since they are altered, then you're not going to get the true data story, for instance, because some things have been coarsened over time. So, oh yeah. All right, I think that's time's up. I'm getting the signal. So if you have any more questions, because I was rambling at the end of like, call to arms, guys, teach it more. I'm not a teacher, but if you are, please teach it more. Feel free to contact me. Here's my contact information. And I guess, because it was already shout out, I do have a book that is coming out in November. That's a general audience that will actually target it more to federal agencies, but assumes no knowledge about privacy prior to the book. What is the title? I will quickly drop the link because I have a personal website, and so I made a page for it because I was like, yeah, well, I wrote a book. Look, guys, look, I can write things.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Claire, for answering all those questions. So it's actually a good thing that you got through a little quicker because there were lots of good questions. So that basically wraps us up for the conference. Absolutely thank you to everyone who joined. I know, as I mentioned earlier on, that it can be, this is, probably everyone's 15th virtual conference at this point in the last couple of years, but we really appreciate you joining us. And to echo, I guess, a call to arms, here's sort of the call to action. If you're interested in helping with organization or speaking next year, or you want to give us any sort of free form feedback, please feel free to email us. This you can use this contact email, or you can use the contact form that's out there on the North website that you all went to before. You should receive a survey probably within the day. You'll get an email from Ursa just sort of wrapping things up. That will also have information on how you can access, or that we will be posting recordings from this conference in the next couple of months. Give us a little bit of time to get that loaded up to YouTube, but once those are available, you should receive an email. And some folks have been randomly selected to receive a Starbucks gift card, so look for that. That part is not spam. We want you to be properly caffeinated for all your future R endeavors. And so with that, I will close us out. And again, really appreciate everyone joining, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.